there's a reason why I called our ministry Soul Life, because I really believe um, that we are souls, that we are integrated beings, that we and I take this from some of the work of Dallas Willard in a book he wrote called Renovation of the Heart, where he talks about the soul as having five components. And I think for me, it just helped me understand that I'm not just a spirit. I have a spiritual life, but I also have a mental life. I have a mind. I have an emotional life. I have a physical body, and I have relationships. And those five areas are a really important part of who I am. I'm not just I'm not just my mind. I'm not just my emotions. I'm not just my spirit. I'm not just my body. I'm not just my relationships. But all of those different elements um, are my integrated self. That's me as a human person, and I see discipleship as following Jesus with all these five elements, and being able to broaden my discipleship so that I'm seeking to be a be a really great disciple of and a steward of my own life. Um, and so obviously there's a spiritual element to that, and how we steward our life with God. Um, and I guess that's where we start. And I think probably that's the pointy end of your question.
Mm.
Um, and and I think our life with God is a relationship. I love the fact that in John 15, Jesus says, "I no longer call you servants; I call you friends." Well, how do we steward friendship? Um, Friendship means it's a relationship. Means that we spend time with one another. Means that we find ways to be present to each other. Um, and there are lots of spiritual practices that help us to do that. And for the last 2,000 years, Christians have found all sorts of traditional, spiritual practices that have helped them to nurture their relationship with God, whether it's reading scripture, or whether it's worship, whether it's prayer, whether it's times of solitude and silence, whether it's fasting. Um, there's just a range of different spiritual practices that help us to become aware of God's presence in our life, and draws us more deeply in our relationship with Him. Um, but I also believe there's no limit to the amount of spiritual practices that we can also have. I don't think there's a defined limit. So I encourage people, and my world is I work with pastors. I encourage pastors to think about, well, what are the creative spiritual practices that we can engage with? Um, I talk about a friend of mine who has a spiritual practice of making a cup of coffee in the morning and wrapping his hands around the cup of coffee, and as he
Mm.
does that, he uh, he uh, he pauses for a moment of prayer and just feels the warmth of the mug, and just thanks God for his love for him for that day, and then he seeks to pray that, look, God, help me to be a loving presence to those who I'm with today. Um, Help me to be aware of the warmth of your love throughout the day. And in some ways, that is now a spiritual practice for him. And as I started to think about spiritual practices going back 2,000 years, um, what were the elements that turned something into a spiritual practice, whether it was fasting or prayer or worship or reading scripture? And I came down to four simple things that I think every spiritual practice, in essence, has. And so, therefore, we can actually be creative and find spiritual practices that are out of the box if they if they if they can do these four things. And I'll talk about one of my creative ones in a minute. And
Mm.
these are the four things. Firstly, a spiritual practice helps us to become aware of God's presence. Helps us to become aware of God's presence. Secondly, a spiritual practice helps us to gain a revelation from God. So in some ways, God speaks to us about His truth in some way. Thirdly, spiritual practice is a practice that we do that helps us to respond to God. So we're invited to respond to Him in some way. And the final thing is that a spiritual practice will ultimately shape us to be formed in the way of Jesus. So it will over time just help us to be shaped more like Jesus. So one of the things that I started doing was exploring kayaking. I love to get out on the water, on pit water, and go kayaking. And I thought maybe I can turn kayaking into a spiritual practice. And it actually has become a spiritual practice. So I can get out on the water, and when I'm out on a beautiful still morning with a in winter you got that beautiful little layer of fog, and the water's glassy, and I just become aware of God's presence around me. Sometimes I'll see an eagle soar, and I'll stop paddling, and I'll just look up and just be in awe of God's creation. I'm wrapped in God's presence, and then that invites me to listen. What's God saying here to me? And God speaks to me about His sovereignty, that He's got all the world, in His hand, that I can trust Him, that He's feeding the birds of the air, and He'll feed me. I don't need to worry about anything. I gain a revelation of God's immanence, of God's capacity to meet the needs that I have for the day, and then that invites me to respond to Him in prayer, of being thankful, of worshiping Him, and then I think it ends up shaping me in the way of Jesus, because I finished that time feeling a lot more centered on God, a lot more grateful, a lot more trusting, a lot more peaceful, and so look, going out kayaking can be a spiritual practice. So I think one of the ways that we steward and keep our spiritual lives fresh is by finding spiritual practices that help us to do those four things. And if you've been stuck in the rut of just a couple of spiritual practices and they've become boring, they've just become duty rather than delight, then I would encourage you just stop doing them. To find some new, fresh spiritual practices that help you to become aware of God's presence, help you gain a revelation about Him, helps you respond to Him, and will ultimately then shape you in the way of Jesus. And so I just encourage people to experiment, find some new ways, and make sure that our practices aren't done out of a sense of obligation or duty, but they ought to be done out of a sense of delight and joy and freedom.